I was eating cold ravioli straight out of the can with a plastic fork when I found the footlocker with my name stenciled on the side. 6 months earlier, I had a husband, 2 kids, a house 40 steps from the water, a job I had built with my own 2 hands out of my dead father's boatyard. Then my sister took all of it. She called it love. He called it finally being honest. I called it the day I stopped believing in blood. That night, my phone lit up in the dark of a 5x10 storage unit. A message from my ex-husband. 6 words. You'll die poor and alone, Marin. And I almost believed him. I did. For about 4 more hours, I believed him. Until I put a screwdriver through the lock of that footlocker and found $52,000 in banded cash and a letter from an uncle who had been dead for 3 weeks. This is only fuel, the letter said. The fire is waiting at these coordinates. What I found at those coordinates didn't just change my life. It changed everything I thought I knew about who the villain in my story actually was. Because I got my revenge. I got all of it. It just wasn't the revenge I wanted. Stay with me. My name is Marin Kessler, and 6 months ago my life looked flawless from the outside. That's the thing nobody tells you about a good life. From the outside you can't see the load-bearing walls. You can't see which ones are already rotted through. We lived in Brightwater, Michigan, a lake town of 9,000 people where the water is so blue in July that tourists pull over on the highway just to photograph it, and so gray in February that the whole place feels like it's holding its breath. Our house was small and stubborn and mine, white clapboard, green door, a crooked porch, and a kitchen window over the sink where I could see the harbor lights come on at dusk. My husband was Grant Merrick, 41 years old, 6'2", with the kind of easy handsome that makes strangers hand him things. Waitresses remembered his order. Bankers took his calls. In 17 years, I never once saw him have to explain himself twice. And our kids. God, our kids! Cole was 13. Hockey was his religion. He had my father's hands. Big, clumsy, capable, and he was at that age where he'd let me hug him only in the car, only with the windows up. Ivy was 8, and Ivy was Sunlight with a stubborn streak. She slept with a stuffed otter named Captain that had been washed so many times it had gone the color of weak tea. Every night she made me check the closet. Every night I told her the same thing. Nothing in this house is stronger than your mother. I want you to remember that line. It comes back later, and when it does, it's going to hurt. I ran operations at Kessler Marine Works, the boatyard my father built in 1991 out of a leaking Quonset hut and a bank loan he shouldn't have qualified for. Thomas Kessler, 11 years old, is how old I was when he died. I'll get to that. That's the whole story, actually, though I didn't know it yet. After Dad died, my mother sold 60% of the yard to keep the lights on and keep us fed. She cried the whole day she signed. I spent the next 20 years grinding my way from sweeping the shop floor at 15 to running the place at 34, rebuilding my father's company for people whose faces I had never seen. And my little sister worked there with me. Delaney Laney, 4 years younger, funnier than me, prettier than me, the one who could talk a customer out of a complaint and into a bigger invoice. Everyone in that yard loved her. She brought donuts on Fridays. She remembered everyone's kids' names. She was the warm one, and I was the one with the clipboard, and that arrangement worked for us for 11 years. I thought we were a team. 2 Kessler girls, no father, dead mother, nobody left but each other, sisters against the world. Then came the 14th of January. It was 4:40 in the afternoon, and the sky outside my office was already going the color of a bruise. An email came in from an address that was just a jumble of letters and numbers. No name. The subject line was 4 words. You deserve to know. There was no message, just an attachment. And I want to be honest with you about what happened in my body when I opened it, because I've heard people describe this moment 100 times, and they always make it sound loud. It wasn't loud. It was a photograph, taken at night. Grant's truck in the gravel lot behind the yard's paint shed, and Grant standing against the driver's door with his hand in my sister's hair and her face turned up to his. And my actual first thought was not, how could they... My first thought was, she's wearing my coat, the green wool one with the torn pocket. I'd left it in her car in November. I sat there for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 because I watched the clock on my monitor and couldn't make my hands move. Then I drove home with the radio off. Grant was in the kitchen, standing at the counter scrolling. Cole was upstairs. Ivy was at a friend's. The house smelled like the chili he'd started, which is a detail my brain has never let go of, that he was making us dinner. I held up my phone. I said, "What is this?" He looked at it. He looked at it for maybe 2 seconds, and then he sighed. He sighed, like I'd asked him to take out the trash again, and set his phone down and said, "Marin, don't do the thing where you make this bigger than it is." I said, "That's my sister." And he said, "You've been gone for 3 years. You're at that yard till 9 o'clock. You come home and you fall asleep on the couch with a spreadsheet on your chest." Lainey actually looks at me. That was it. That was the whole defense. 12 years of marriage, 2 children, a mortgage, my mother's funeral where he carried the casket. And the summary was that I worked too much, and my sister looked at him. I didn't scream. I've thought about that a lot since. Everyone expects the screaming. I just stood in my own kitchen and felt the floor tilt about 4 degrees to the left and stay there for the next 6 months. The next morning I drove to the yard at 6 because I always drove to the yard at 6, and Lainey's car was already in the lot. She got out. She walked right up to me in the freezing dark with her breath steaming, and she said the sentence that ended us. "Marin, I need you to not make this ugly. Not I'm sorry, not I'll leave town. Just please don't make this ugly. Please be convenient while I take your husband. And here's where I have to tell you something, and I need you to hold on to it, because at the time it looked like arrogance, and it took me 6 months and 900 miles to understand what it actually was." Her hands were shaking so hard she dropped her keys. I thought she was afraid of me. She wasn't. 9 days later, the board called me in. The Kessler Marine Works board was 3 people I'd met twice a year for a decade, and a chairman on speakerphone from Chicago whose voice I knew better than his face. The meeting lasted 6 minutes. I have the calendar invite still. 6 minutes to end 20 years. Restructuring, new direction. We're consolidating operations under a single director. I said, "Which director?" There was a pause on that speakerphone that I will hear until the day I die. Delaney Kessler. My sister took my father's boatyard on a Thursday and put her nameplate on my door by Monday. I know because I drove past. I want to say I didn't, but I did. I drove past 4 times that week like a woman circling her own grave. 2 weeks later, the second letter came. My severance had been adjusted, that's the word they used, adjusted, pending an internal review. The allegation was that I had accessed and copied protected client files and vendor contracts in my final week. I hadn't, but my login had, from a terminal in the front office. At 7:15 in the evening on a day, I was at Cole's hockey practice in Traverse City, which I could have proven if anyone with power had wanted proof. Nobody did. So there was no severance. And then, because a woman under investigation is a woman without a reference, there was no other job in a 9,000-person town where everyone bought their boat parts from the same place. Grant filed for divorce in March, and Grant fought dirty in a way I truly did not think a person who had held my hand through 2 labors was capable of. Unstable, obsessive, under investigation for corporate theft, emotionally volatile, and he had a text thread to prove it, 41 messages I'd sent him in the worst 3 weeks of my life, stripped of everything he'd said back. He had a therapist's note from 6 years ago when I went on antidepressants after my mother died. He had a neighbor who testified I'd been seen sitting in my parked car outside the house at night. I had been, because my children were inside it. He got the house, he got primary custody with supervised visitation for me 1 Saturday a month, 4 hours, at a family center with a woman named Brenda taking notes on a clipboard. And Lainey sat in the 3rd row of that courtroom in a navy dress with her hands folded, and she did not look at me one single time. The day the order was signed, it was raining so hard the parking lot had turned into a shallow lake. I stood on the courthouse steps with an umbrella that wouldn't open, just clicking the button over and over like an idiot, and my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. "You'll die poor and alone, Marin. Lainey's better with them in a month than you were in 13 years. Let go." I read it maybe 40 times, and something inside me went very quiet, not broken. People always say broken. It was quieter than broken. It was the sound a house makes when the power goes out and you finally hear how loud everything had been. I didn't know it that night, standing in that flood in my one good blazer. But that was the last night of my old life. Not the divorce, not the firing, That message, that was the hinge. Because the man who sent it made exactly one mistake. He assumed I had nothing left to lose. Poverty doesn't happen the way movies show it. It's not a montage. It's a series of small arithmetic problems that each have only one answer. The savings went to the lawyer, and the lawyer went to the same golf course as Grant's father, which is the thing I found out too late. Rent on the apartment I'd moved into went unpaid in April, then again in May, and the landlord was decent about it for exactly as long as decency was free. I remember the grocery store. Everybody who's been through this remembers the grocery store. I was standing in aisle 4 with a carton of milk and a box of pasta, and I did the math 3 times and put the milk back and walked out, and a girl in a green apron said, "Have a good one," and I said, "You too," in a completely normal voice. By the end of May, I was sleeping in my car behind the old Bayview Diner off Route 31, which had closed in 2020 and never reopened. I'd park at the back where the dumpster hid the plate, run the engine 20 minutes at 3 a.m. when the cold got real, and wash up in the gas station bathroom at 6 before anyone was around to see. It was the diner's owner who found me. His name was Hollis Byrne. He was 70-something, and he still came by twice a week to check the pipes on a building that would never serve another egg. He knocked on my window with one knuckle, and when I scrambled up, he just handed me a thermos of coffee and looked out at the lake instead of at me, which I have never forgotten. He said, "There's storage units up on Cutler Road. Fella there don't ask questions. Cheaper than nothing, and the roof don't leak." I want you to remember Hollis Byrne, because Hollis Byrne was not a coincidence, and I didn't find that out for another 4 months. Unit D14, 5 feet by 10, $74 a month. A cot, a camp lantern, a 2-burner propane stove that I only ran with the door cracked, 2 boxes of clothes, 3 photo albums, Cole's baby shoe, a shoebox of Ivy's drawings, which I could not look at and could not throw away, so it stayed taped shut under the cot. The wall of sweat in the morning. The whole row of units popped and groaned when the temperature changed, like the building was full of people shifting in their sleep. At night, the trucks on Cutler Road would go by and the light would come through the gap under the door in one long stripe, and I would lie there and think, this is the size of my life now, 50 square feet, and I'm 40% of the way through my time on Earth. That's not being dramatic. That's just what you think at 2 a.m. in a metal box. On the 11th of June, I sold my wedding ring at a pawn shop in Cadillac for $160, which was insulting, and I took it, which was worse. I bought gas, a loaf of bread, a bag of apples, 4 cans of ravioli, and a jar of peanut butter, and I drove back to Cutler Road with $11 left in the world. And that's the night it happened. I was sitting on the cot eating cold ravioli out of the can because lighting the stove felt like too much effort for one person, and I dropped the fork. It skittered back behind the broken office chair that had come with the unit, the one I'd never moved because it was wedged in the back corner, and I had nowhere to move it to. I pulled the chair out, I put my flashlight on the floor, and a beam caught the corner of something olive green. A footlocker. Old military type, steel corners, 2 latches, and a 3-digit combination lock on a hasp. Dust on the lid, a 1/4 inch thick, and on the end, in white stenciled paint, gone chalky with age, M.J. Kessler. Marin Josephine Kessler. I sat down on the concrete floor. I remember the cold of it coming through my jeans. I had never owned that footlocker. I had never seen it. I had rented that unit 6 weeks earlier from a man in a booth who didn't even look up from his crossword, and it had been listed as empty, and I had personally swept it out. I tried the lock. 3 digits. I tried my birthday, Cole's, Ivy's, my wedding date, which made me feel sick, the year my mother died. Nothing. And then, sometime after midnight, lying in the dark with my heart going like a bird in a box, I remembered a boat. My father built a little cedar skiff the summer I turned 9, and he let me paint the whole number on the bow myself, and I did it crooked and he never fixed it. 419. I named my daughter after that boat, the Ivy Nell. I crawled off the cot and turned the dial on the flashlight beam. 4199. The lock opened in my hand like it had been waiting 11 years for somebody to remember. Inside, under a folded canvas tarp, were 8 bundles of $100 bills with paper bands from Superior Community Trust in Houghton, Michigan, and on top of them, an envelope. My name on the front in handwriting that leaned so far to the right it looked like it was running. I knew that handwriting. I'd gotten one birthday card a year in it until I was about 19, and then they stopped. Marin. If you're reading this, they've taken it all and you've hit the bottom. Good, nobody can see the whole board until they're standing under it. The money in this box is not the point, it's fuel. Buy something with four-wheel drive and don't tell a soul. The rest of it, the money, the land, and the truth about how your father actually died is waiting at 401741 Fortin North, 87 Tyne 22 West. Come alone, come in daylight. The key is taped under the tray. I'm sorry I let you grow up believing the story they told you. I was a coward for 30 years, and I'm running out of time to stop being one. Fuel isn't the fire, Marin. You are. Uncle Silas. Silas Kessler. My father's older brother. Merchant Marine, then 22 years on Great Lakes freighters, then nothing, a man who showed up at Thanksgiving smelling like diesel and cigarettes, who called the Merrick family the suits on the dock, and told my father to get everything in writing, Tommy, everything, while my mother made a face at me across the table that meant ignore your uncle. Nah. After my father died, Silas came to the funeral, stood at the back, didn't sit with us, and left before the reception, and then he was gone, up north somewhere. Everyone said he'd lost it. My aunt used the word unwell, the way people do when they mean inconvenient. I had not spoken to him in 11 years. I counted the money on the cot, $52,000. And then I did what any sane person does, and I looked him up on my cracked phone using the gas station's Wi-Fi, because I wanted to call him and scream at him. There was an obituary, 2 paragraphs, in the Daily Mining Gazette. Silas Thomas Kessler, 78, of Quinault County, died May 29. Merchant mariner, no services, no survivors listed. 3 weeks. He'd been dead 3 weeks. I sat in that unit with $52,000 in my lap and a dead man's handwriting in my hand, and outside a truck went by and laid that stripe of light across the floor, and I said out loud to nobody, "How did you know where to find me?" Because that's the question, isn't it? Somebody put that footlocker in the unit I would happen to rent. Somebody knew I'd be there. And I want to be clear about my state of mind at 2 a.m. on the 12th of June. I did not think inheritance, I thought trap. I thought, this is a man who's been dead 3 weeks, offering me 900 miles of driving into the empty top of Michigan alone, into the woods, with cash in the car. Then I read the letter one more time, and I got to the line about my father. The truth about how your father actually died. Here's the thing about my father's death that I have never in 26 years been able to put down. Thomas Kessler died on the 4th of April, 2000, at the yard he built, when a hoist strap failed and a 31-foot Chris-Craft came off the lift and took him with it. Instant. That's what everyone said, always in the same tone, like it was a mercy they were handing me. It was instant, honey. The report said equipment failure. Operator error, possibly, since he was alone in the shed at 7 in the morning, which he never was, because my father was rigorously safe. He made me wear a life vest in a rowboat in 4 feet of water until I was 12 years old. And every single time I asked my mother a question about it, one question ever at any age, she went the color of paper and said, "Let it rest, Marin, please, let him rest." I thought that was grief. I sat on that cot until the light came up gray under the door, and then I made the only decision available to a woman with nothing left to lose and a dead man's map. I bought a 2009 Silverado with 210,000 miles from a guy in Manistee for $4,000 cash, no questions. I bought boots, a coat, a proper flashlight, a paper atlas because I didn't trust my phone, and a folding knife I did not want to think about needing. I put the rest of the money in a canvas bag under the passenger seat. Before I pulled out of Cutler Road, I looked back at Unit D14 with its door rolled up and my cot inside and the light coming in. I said, "Goodbye, rock bottom." And then I drove north, and I want to be honest, a small, ugly, wonderful part of me was excited for the first time in half a year, and I felt guilty about it, and I did it anyway. 9 hours to the bridge, then the Upper Peninsula, which does not look like America. It looks like the world before people. 200 miles of jack pine and tamarack swamp with a gas station every 40 minutes in radio that goes to static and stays there. I slept one night in the truck outside Marquette with the doors locked and the money under my knees. I ate gas station coffee and beef jerky and a bruised banana. And somewhere on that road, north of Houghton, going over the lift bridge with Portage Lake, black and flat below me, I caught myself in the mirror. Hollow, gray under the eyes, 40 pounds of grief on a frame that used to be strong. But my hands on the wheel were steady. That was new. The Quinault is a finger of rock reaching 100 miles out into Lake Superior, and the road up it narrows the whole way like the land itself is losing confidence. Past Calumet, past Copper Harbor. Then a gravel road with no sign, and then a 2-track with grass growing up the middle. My phone went to no service 8 miles before the coordinates and never came back. The 2-track ended at a steel gate with a chain and a padlock and a sign so faded I had to get out and stand close to read it. Government property, decommissioned, no admittance. Under that, newer hand-painted in white on a scrap of plywood wired to the post, Kessler Private. The key from under the footlocker tray fit the padlock. I want to tell you what that sounded like. That chain coming off in my hands, in total silence. Nothing but Superior somewhere ahead making that low sound it makes, which is not waves, it's more like breathing. I left the truck and walked half a mile of trail through birch. The ground went from dirt to bare rock. The trees got shorter and more crooked, the way they do when they've spent a century getting hit by wind off the biggest lake on earth. And then the trees stopped and I came out on a headland. There was a rock formation on the point, 40 feet of it layered basalt tipped up on edge so the whole mass came to a raised prow, exactly like the bow of a ship driving into the sky. Silas's letter had called it nothing. It didn't need to. You'd know it if you saw it. Behind it, tucked into the lee of the rock where the wind couldn't get at it, was a house. Not a shack, not a hunting cabin. A decommissioned fog signal station, squat, brick, white paint gone chalk, with a boarded lantern room on the seaward end. And bolted to the south face, 8 solar panels, a satellite dish, a propane tank the size of a car. And from behind the building, faint under the sound of the lake, the hum of a generator that was still, 3 weeks after the death of the only man who knew it existed, running. I stood there in that grass for a long time. "Uncle Silas," I said, "what have you been doing out here?" The door was steel. The key opened it. And when it swung, the smell that came out was dust and cold coffee and paper. Thousands and thousands of pages of paper. And I stepped inside, and I understood in about 4 seconds that I hadn't found a cabin. I'd walked into 30 years of my family's buried life. The main room was maybe 20 by 30, and every inch of every wall was covered. Photographs, newspaper clippings in plastic sleeves, ledger pages, photocopies of photocopies of photocopies, and red yarn. Real red yarn, the kind you use to make a scarf, running from pin to pin to pin, a web that started on the north wall and crossed the whole room. Dead center, at the origin of everything, was a photograph I had never seen. My father, 35 years old, in a canvas coat, standing on a dock in front of the Quonset hut, shaking hands with a tall man in a wool overcoat, both of them squinting into the sun, both of them smiling. Under it, in Silas's slanted hand, T. Kessler W. Merrick Dock Lease and Option Agreement, Hollow Point, March 1996. W. Merrick. Warren Merrick. My father-in-law, Cole and Ivy's grandfather. The man who owned the marina, the 2 hotels on the bluff, the fuel depot, 40 rental properties, and through 3 shell companies I could now see mapped on the wall in my uncle's handwriting, 60% of Kessler Marine Works. The man who had sat at the head of my dining room table on Christmas Day for 11 years and carved the ham. I followed the yarn. It went from that photograph to a folder pinned open, and on the folder in block letters my uncle had written 5 words. They killed him for the point. Hollow Point, 41 acres of shoreline south of the harbor. My father bought it in 1994 for almost nothing because it was too rocky to build on and too shallow to dock at. And he bought it because he wanted his kids to have somewhere to swim that nobody could ever put a fence around. Except in 1996, a survey came back. And underneath Hollow Point, running out under the lake bed, was a shelf of glacial aggregate, sand and gravel, and, more importantly, the only natural deepwater channel on 11 miles of that coast. You cannot build a commercial deepwater terminal on the west side of that county anywhere else, not one. My uncle had the Corps of Engineer surveys in triplicate dated to prove it. Warren Merrick offered my father $280,000 in 1997. My father declined. He offered $498,000. He offered a partnership in 99. There were letters. Actual letters on Merrick Harbor Group letterhead, each one warmer and then each one colder. And the last one, dated the 22nd of March, 2000, was 4 lines long, and the 4th line said, "I would encourage you to reconsider before circumstances make the decision for you." 13 days later, my father was dead. And here is what my uncle spent 26 years assembling, pinned to a wall in a fog station at the top of the world, where nobody would ever look. The hoist strap that failed was inspected and signed off 8 days before. The inspection was subcontracted to a rigging outfit that billed Merrick Harbor Group, not Kessler Marine, and dissolved as a company 14 months later. There was a work order for that strap dated the 3rd of April, the day before, for adjustment, signed by a shop hand named Douglas Rell. Doug Rell left Brightwater 2 months after the funeral and turned up in Sarasota, Florida, with a paid-off house. My father's life insurance had been increased in January of 2000, not by my father, by the yard. Under a key man policy the majority partner had taken out and, in a rider I read 4 times to be sure I understood, was entitled to 60% of. And 2 days before he died, my father had done the thing his brother had told him to do for years. He'd gotten it in writing. He'd signed a deed restriction placing Hollow Point in a trust for his children, unsellable and undevelopable, until the youngest turned 35. Witnessed by Silas T. Kessler. Filed with the county on the 6th of April, 2 days after my father was killed, by a man who'd driven down from the Keweenaw and walked into the Register of Deeds office with his brother's body still in the county morgue and made sure the paper landed. That's why he ran, and I hadn't known. I found out later he'd been a coward exactly once. He went to the state police in 1996, in July, 3 months after the funeral, with the letters and the work order. And the file went to a lieutenant who was 6 years later the best man at the wedding of Warren Merrick's attorney. And 2 weeks after that, Silas Kessler's truck was run off M26 outside Eagle River at night by a vehicle that never stopped, and he spent 9 weeks in a hospital in Hancock, and when he came out he stopped talking to anybody in our family for 26 years. He didn't disappear because he lost his mind. He disappeared because he'd figured out he could either be alive or be believed. And he picked alive, and he spent the rest of his life building a case so heavy that nobody could pick it up and throw it away again. I was still standing in the middle of that room, shaking, when I turned around, and on the opposite wall, under a work light, was a second web, smaller, newer, the photographs in color. The card at the top of it said, D. Kessler. Delaney, my sister. I did not want to look at it. I want that on the record. Every part of me wanted to take the money and the deed and drive south and burn the rest. Instead, I stood in front of my sister's wall for 4 hours, and by the end of it, I was sitting on the floor with my back against a filing cabinet, and I understood that I had spent 6 months hating the wrong person. I'm going to tell you what was on that wall in the order I found it, because that's the order that took me apart. A photograph of Laney at 16, Brightwater High parking lot, getting into the passenger seat of a black Tahoe. The driver in 3 separate photographs from 3 separate dates was Dane Merrick Grant's older brother, 24 years old that summer. A copy of a birth record from a hospital in Petoskey, 70 miles down the coast, dated the 9th of February, 2010. Baby boy, 6 pounds 2 ounces. Mother, Delaney R. Kessler, age 17. Father, unlisted. Private adoption placement, arranged and paid for by a family law practice retained by Merrick Harbor Group, with a couple in Charlevoix, a couple where the husband had been a Merrick property manager for 9 years. And then 22 pages of what my uncle in his blunt sailor's handwriting had labeled the leash. A supervised visitation schedule, 2 afternoons a year, Easter and the first Sunday of October for 15 years, signed off each time by the adoptive family. Conditional, revocable, at will. Photographs of my sister at 19, at 24, at 29, at 31, sitting on a bench in a park in Charlevoix, on the first Sunday in October next to a boy who got taller in every picture. His name was Eli. He was 15. He had my father's jaw. He had my son's ears. I had a nephew, and he lived 70 miles from my house, and I had never been told he existed. My mother's hospice bills, $19,000 of them, paid in 2019 by an LC that traced back through 2 shells to Merrick Harbor Group. My mother, who died holding my hand, thanking God for the kindness of Warren Merrick, and at the end of it, in a plastic sleeve, a printed thread of text messages from October of last year that my uncle had gotten, I never learned how, and Silas Kessler took a lot of things to his grave between Warren Merrick and my sister. I'm not going to quote them. I've read them maybe 200 times, and I'm not going to say them out loud. The shape of them was this. The trust on Hollow Point had a clause. If my father's children died or were found unfit, the trust could be broken by petition of the guardian of his grandchildren. The guardian of his grandchildren. They didn't want my husband. They didn't want my job. They didn't want my house. They wanted my children because my children were the key to 41 acres of rock and a deep water channel and a $200 million terminal, and my father had built the lock out of his own kids, and my uncle had welded it shut. And Delaney's job, the job assigned to her, with her sons 2 afternoons a year as the price of failure, was to be the reason I lost them. She was told to make me look unstable. She was told to move into my house. She was told to be a better mother than me in a courtroom in front of a judge. And here's the part where I broke. On the 14th of January at 4:38 in the afternoon, an email had gone out from a public terminal at the Brightwater District Library from an account created 11 minutes earlier to my work address with 1 attachment and 4 words in the subject line. You deserve to know. My uncle had a photograph of the library parking lot that afternoon, taken from across the street. My sister's car. She sent it. She took the photograph herself and sent it to me, because it was the only way she could find to blow up the plan without saying a word out loud, because she was being watched, and she knew it, and if they'd known she'd warned me, she would have lost her son forever. Mirren, I need you to not make this ugly. She wasn't gloating. She was begging. Make it ugly, she was saying. Please, God, make it ugly enough that I can't finish this. And I didn't understand, and I hated her for 6 months, and while I sat in a 5x10 storage unit eating cold ravioli and cursing her name, she was in my house, brushing my daughter's hair, doing the worst thing she'd ever done, to save a boy nobody would let her call her son. I put my head down on that concrete floor in that fog station, and I cried like an animal. Not for me, for all 4 of us. For my father, who died for a piece of rock. For my uncle, who lived in a brick box for 26 years so a truth could survive him. For my sister at 16, getting into a black Tahoe. For me at 11, being told it was instant, honey. I stayed at Going Point for 3 days. There was food, canned, a lot of it. There was a cot. There was a wood stove and an axe and a stack of split maple. And at night the wind came off Superior and hit that brick like it was personally offended by it. And on the last morning I found the second envelope taped to the underside of the desk drawer. My uncle wrote on it, Your move, Sikke Porstakke. Inside, a flash drive, a certified copy of a will, and 1 page. Mirren. Everything's in the drive. Duplicated in a deposit box at Superior Community Trust, Houghton, in your name. Opened in 2011. Paid up through 2041. If they take one, take the other. The estate is yours. Hollow Point comes out of trust to you and Delaney and the children. There's the aggregate lease, the channel option, the accounts. Lawyer Marquette has the numbers. It's more than you're ready for. Take it and go if you want. Buy a house somewhere warm and be a mother and let it die with me. I mean that nobody on this earth would hold it against you, least of all me. Or finish it. But if you finish it, understand what I got wrong. I spent 26 years building a case against men. It took me 20 of those years to see that they had put a girl in the middle of it, and that she was 17 years old when they started, and that your father would have wanted somebody to go get her. Your sister is not the enemy. She is the hostage. Truth costs. It'll take your peace before it gives you anything back. But you'll be free, and free is the only thing they can't take twice. Fuel isn't the fire, Mirren. Sake. The number when I finally got it from the lawyer in Marquette was $64 million. I laughed out loud in his office. I'd had $11 3 weeks earlier. And then I asked him one question, and it was not about the money. I asked him who had been paying $74 a month for a storage unit on Cutler Road in Brightwater, Michigan, since the 22nd of May. He looked at his file, and he looked up, and he said, "A gentleman named Hollisburn, on instruction." Hollisburn had served with Silas Kessler on the Arthur B. Homer in 1974. My uncle had been dying of pancreatic cancer since February. He had known from a friend who watched the county filings exactly what was happening to me, and he had 16 weeks left and no way to protect me from any of it, so he did the only thing left. He had his oldest friend put a roof over my head, and he put a footlocker under a broken chair, and he set my father's hull number on the lock so that only I could open it, and he died 3 weeks before I found it. I called the FI field office in Detroit from the parking lot of a gas station in Baraga, with my hands flat on the hood of my truck to keep them still. I said, "My name is Maren Kessler. I have documentary evidence of a homicide in 2000, 30 years of financial fraud, and an ongoing conspiracy involving the custody of 2 minor children. I have somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 pages, and I need somebody to tell me where to bring it." The agent's name was Nadia Reyes. 15 years in public corruption. She had a voice like somebody reading a grocery list, which I came to find enormously comforting. She did not believe me. She was polite, and she took my information, and I could hear in her tone that I was the 9th call that week from somebody who'd lost a custody battle and found a conspiracy. Then she drove 9 hours north and stood in that fog station for a day and a half. And when she came out onto the headland, where I was sitting on the rock in the wind, she sat down next to me and she said, "Ms. Kessler, I need you to not talk to a single human being about this. Not one. For as long as it takes." It took 4 months and 9 days. 4 months of a motel in Escanaba under a name that wasn't mine. 4 months of forensic accountants and a grand jury I never saw, and phone calls where Nadia told me nothing in a very reassuring way. 4 months of not calling my children, which was the worst thing I have ever had to do on purpose. I don't have the words for that. Every Saturday I would sit on that motel bed at 10 in the morning, which was my 4 hours at the family center, and know that Brenda with the clipboard was writing Mother did not appear for the 4th week, the 8th week, the 12th. Nadia told me what that would look like in a courtroom later, and I said do it anyway. And in month 3 I asked for the one thing that wasn't in the plan. I said, "Before you arrest my sister, I want 20 minutes with her." They said absolutely not. I said, "Then I want 20 minutes with her, wearing a wire, on your terms, with your people in the parking lot, because she's the only one of them who can put Warren Merrick in a room, and she will never talk to a federal agent as long as that boy is a leash around her neck. But she'll talk to me." No. Nadia Reyes looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "You understand that if she doesn't take it, we charge her, and you will have handed us the case against your own sister." I said, "I understand." We met at Riverside Cemetery in Brightwater on the 29th of September at our mother's grave, because it was the only place on earth I knew she'd come alone. I stood there for 11 minutes in the cold with a microphone taped under my collarbone and my heart going so hard I thought it would ruin the audio. And then she came up the row of headstones and saw me and stopped dead and dropped her bag. She'd lost weight. She looked like I'd looked in June. She said, "Maren?" And I said the sentence I'd written on a motel notepad 40 times until it was down to 9 words. "I know about Eli. I know about the Tahoe. I know." And my sister, 33 years old, in my dead mother's coat, standing on my dead mother's grave, put both hands over her face and made a sound I will hear for the rest of my life. She talked for 2 hours and 11 minutes. She was 16 when Dane Merrick started picking her up from school and telling her she was the only interesting person in that town. She was 17 when she was pregnant, and Warren Merrick sat her down in his office with a lawyer and explained, kindly with a hand on her shoulder, what her options were. She was 18 when Dane died, and the last person who knew her son's face as family was gone. And she was 32 when Warren Merrick sat her down in the same office and told her about a trust and a clause and a guardian and explained kindly, with a hand on her shoulder, what her options were. She told me she'd said no for 6 weeks. She told me she'd tried to warn me 3 times before the email. She said she'd made herself sick trying to find a way to blow it up that wouldn't cost Ellie. And she said the thing that finished it. He'll read about it in Minnesota. I sent him the plat map. That's the only petty thing I did, and I'd do it again. Kids swim off those rocks all summer. My kids swim off those rocks. That's what my father bought it for. The rest went into the Gullwing Fund, named for a fog station at the top of the world. We do two things. We pay for lawyers for parents, mostly mothers, not always, who are losing custody to somebody with more money than truth. And we cover first and last month's rent, no application, no interview, for women getting out of the kind of situation where somebody else holds the leash. 411 families so far. And I still pay $74 a month for Unit D14 on Cutler Road. There's nothing in it. Concrete floor, a cot, a camp lantern I don't use. Once or twice a year I drive out and roll up that door and sit in there for 20 minutes with my back against the wall while the trucks go by on the highway. Because that's where the old me died. The one who thought love was supposed to cost you everything you had. The one who thought silence in a family was the same thing as peace. The one who believed that blood meant loyalty, no matter what got done in the dark. Hollis Byrne died last spring, 91 years old, and he's buried 4 rows from my mother, and I paid for the stone. It says he knew where she was. My sister lives in a house 8 minutes from mine. We are not what we were. I don't know if we ever will be. Some Sundays it's easy, and some Sundays I look at her, and I'm 41 years old, and standing in a freezing parking lot hearing "Don't make this ugly," and I have to go stand in the yard for a minute. But her son sets my table on Thanksgiving. And she and I stood on Thomas Kessler Point last July in the water up to our knees, watching 4 kids, mine and hers, try to drown each other off a rock, and neither of us said anything for a long time. Then she said, "Dad would have hated the toilet." And I laughed so hard I sat down in Lake Michigan. People ask me if I got my revenge, and I always say yes, but not the way you think, and here's what I mean by that. Revenge, the way I wanted it in that storage unit, was a courtroom and my sister's face. I wanted her to be evil. I needed her to be evil, because if she was evil, then the world made sense, and I was just unlucky. She wasn't evil. She was 17 and pregnant in a rich man's office in 2010, and nobody in her family, not me, not our mother, nobody, ever noticed a thing. The real revenge was that they built a 30-year machine to take a piece of land out of the hands of Thomas Kessler's children, and his daughter took the machine apart with her bare hands and gave the land away to strangers forever, out of spite and love in exactly equal measure. The real revenge was a 15-year-old boy getting his last name back. The real revenge is that I'm here, on a porch in October, with the coffee going cold, and a dog that isn't allowed on the furniture and is on the furniture, and my father's boatyard runs 3 shifts, and there's a light on upstairs. I lost a husband, a sister, a job, a house, and 4 months of my children's lives in a metal box on Cutler Road. And I got this instead. Clarity, purpose, a nephew, a father I finally know the truth about, and 2 kids who watched their mother come back from the bottom of the world with the receipts. My name is Maren Kessler. They took everything I had and told me I'd die poor and alone. They were half right. I did die. The woman who came back out of that storage unit isn't the one who went in, and she's the one they should have been afraid of. My uncle wrote me one line I keep framed in the hallway now, right where the coats go, where everybody who lives in my house has to walk past it every single morning. Fuel isn't the fire. You are. If you're in your own version of Unit D14 tonight, car, couch, spare room, a house where somebody else holds the leash, I'm not going to tell you a briefcase full of money is coming. Mine did. That was luck. But the money wasn't the thing that got me out. The thing that got me out was one night on a concrete floor when I decided I would rather know the truth than keep the peace. That part isn't luck. That part's available to everybody. That part's just a decision, and you can make it tonight.